Hi everyone, so today we'll be looking at Analysing London by William Blake. As always, we will be using our four-step approach of looking at significance of title, structure and language techniques, and any shift in tone. For more details on this, make sure to watch my other video on how to analyse any poem. The key themes we will be looking at for London are corruption of power, class inequality, moral decay, and oppression. Make sure to make a note of these as we will be linking our analysis back to them. We will also be referencing other things like context throughout the video. So firstly, looking at the significance of the title. The title is a standalone noun of a specific location, London. This being a one-worded title carries a blunt and factual tone, echoing the tone of the poem. It also symbolises the seriousness of the political statement which Blake will go on to make about late 18th century London in his poem. Now moving on to some of the key structural techniques. Go ahead and take a moment to pause and read through to refresh and have a better understanding of the poem. The first key structural technique can be seen in the main body of the poem. It has 4 rigid stanzas with a consistent A-B rhyme scheme. This repetitive structure reflects the strict control and consistency of oppression in London. It also mirrors the vicious cycle which the lower class are suffering as victims of the corruption of power during the late 18th century. In the second stanza, the repetition of the word every emphasises that this suffering is felt by people of all ages. We also see this in the repetition of other words like chartered and mark. In some areas like the third stanza, the use of enjambment, meaning all the lines flow into one another without pauses, also reflects the continued flow of suffering. However, some later lines do have pauses, otherwise known as caesura, for instance, after mine-forged manacles. This effectively forces the reader to stop and reflect on the injustice being described. More specifically, this is how Blake is using poetry to communicate with the late 1800 Londoners who are falling victim to the trap of abuse and corruption of power. This poem functions to make them aware that they must change their mindsets themselves in order for there to be a larger change in society. The last stanza ends in a melancholy tone. This can be considered an example of shift in tone, however it does also fall into structure because it's a significant way to end the poem, leaving the reader feeling an understanding of the grim cycle of misery and death in London. Now it's important that Blake reinforces the idea that innocence and new beginnings like newborn children or marriages are corrupted and ruined due to all being under these high authorities who are abusing their powers. All of these structural techniques work together to create a really powerful stance against corruption. Now let's look at some language techniques. Okay, so we have already made some mention of the use of repetition of certain words. This is really important as it's a simple but effective way which Blake is able to communicate an emphasis on standing up against the corruptive power, which are, to use the words of the poem, blackening church appalls and causing suffering in London. Repeated phrases like chartered are examples of how Blake is immediately able to emphasise his message as well as the state of London. Blake also describes people to be mind-forged manacles, strongly implying they are brainwashed by these corruptive institutions. Take note of the alliteration too, which further pushes this idea. The last 2 stanzas especially use Gothic imagery. This is evident in imagery such as blackening churches, the blood running down the palace walls, and also the midnight streets. This works to create a certain mood, reflecting the atmosphere in London while it's under this villainized control. It's a very captivating way which intrigues the reader. So finally, in the last stanza, we can see there are words being used like youthful or newborn infants, which connote innocence and dedicate a particular attention to the young people suffering in London. This youthful imagery is juxtaposed by phrases like harlot, which is an old-fashioned word for prostitute. This highlights a moral decay in society, but also reflects the desperation of injustice against young people who must face poverty and oppression so early on in their life. Now Blake re-emphasises this idea of London being stuck in this cycle of misery through the use of juxtaposition. Here we have the example, marriage hearse. This suggests that even new beginnings and fresh starts like marriages are doomed by the destructive environment in London. It's also significant that marriage is a religious union. The reason I mention this is because it's important to note down how Blake has been consistently pushing the idea of things we would usually associate with religion to be exploited by governments and higher authorities, Of course, an example of this is the blackening churches. This specifically reflects the corruption of the church at the time and how religion was manipulated and used to further abuse the people in society. Okay, so now let's take a quick look at the shifts in tone throughout the poem. The poem initially starts with a tone of despair, which gradually builds towards anger. The anger then evolves into a more tragic and dark tone towards the end of the poem. We can see this in the passionate use of language throughout to reflect on the state of London. This also goes hand in hand with the structural and language techniques we just looked at together. It's great to mention this in your exam response. For this poem, the significance of the shift in tone allows the reader to feel as though they are walking through and observing London with the narrator. This functions effectively to be really emotive, reflective, and also still stand as a call for revolution. Okay, so now for the last part. Let's look at some anthology poems from the AQA Power and Conflict collection which we could compare London to. Firstly, looking at exposure. Both poems present a group of people to be trapped in a particular dynamic. In London, we see the lower class to be trapped in a world of suffering and poverty, and in exposure, we see soldiers awaiting their inevitable death on a battlefield. Both poems are personal accounts and present feelings of abandonment by the higher power. In London, the narrator is shown to lose hope in the government and institutions coming to the rescue of those who are suffering, whilst the narrator in exposure expresses his loss of hope in religion and God. Now, another poem which you could compare London to is Checking Out Me History, with both poems showing a specific group of people being oppressed by an authoritative figure. London attacks the monarchy, church, and government, whilst Checking Out Me History criticises colonial education for controlling and allowing the loss of individual history and identity. Both also portray the theme of people being trapped under a certain ruling. When comparing, don't forget to contrast too. For example, a key contrast between London and Checking Out Me History is how they end. London presents suffering as inescapable, whilst Checking Out Me History ends with hope and resistance. London focuses on physical and social suffering, whilst Checking Out Me History highlights intellectual oppression. Now, of course, these are just suggestions, so please do let me know in the comments any other poems you would compare London to. That concludes our video on the analysis of London by William Blake. I hope that was helpful. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more, and I will see you in my next video.